We're delighted that the working group is sharing the results of their work to share practical ways to run effective pause and reflect sessions. So this working group of Curve community members will be sharing a perspective on this, on how pause and reflect might be practiced most effectively. Why have we chosen pause and reflect as a topic? Well, pause and reflect is an excellent tool for making the most of responsive feedback because it enables focused and critical reflection on what we are learning from feedback and what we should do in response. So pausing and reflecting is an opportunity for active study of how we are doing and how we might do better. After the presentation, we have some time reserved for discussion and feedback with you, where we welcome you to share further ideas, perspectives, and advice. We will ask working group members to turn their cameras on for that Q&A session, and we'll welcome your questions to them and your comments. Your feedback will be the final publication of this perspective, which will be published and shared in coming weeks. So I'll now hand over to the working group to introduce themselves and share their presentation.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Hope you're well and keeping safe in these strange times. I'm Purnima Mehrotra from Ashoka University and here to kick off this session where we will discuss the importance of reflecting on our work. Now, reflection is a topic with a lot of support, and nearly everyone you speak to will agree that it is a valuable exercise that needs to be incorporated in the daily working of our teams and our organizations. However, we feel it does require explicit articulation of its value by laying out empirical evidence, especially because many people argue that time is growing increasingly scarce within organizations due to conflicting demands on people's time, and so individuals have to prioritize urgent or more high-value activities. So it is great that we are using the platform of Curve to pause and reflect on the value of regular. A very brief overview of the agenda for this session. I will speak about the value proposition of pausing and reflecting, as well as how exactly the process works. Elizabeth will discuss the cultural shifts needed in an organization for pause and reflect to take hold. Jarret will then show us some effective techniques of how to actually run pause and reflect sessions. Adolor will explore barriers to engaging in regular pause and reflect activities and possible solutions. And lastly, Helen will close the session with a discussion on helping organizations analyze and use data, especially those where there may not be specific monitoring and evaluation expertise in-house. Now, before we dive right in, let's look at the key concept here. That is reflection. The term reflection can mean many different things to different people. It can range from simply thinking about one's experience as a means to increase awareness. So awareness of our thoughts, feelings, values, or actions, all the way to considering possible alternatives to a problem. For our purposes, a good understanding is reflection, or the intentional attempt to synthesize, abstract, and articulate the key lessons taught by experience. Another useful way of thinking about this concept in this context is critical reflection of assumptions to clearly state the type of reflective practice which is central to all our learning processes. Now, there is considerable literature on the value of engaging in regular and systematic pause and reflect sessions, and I'll take a minute to mention some of the most often quoted ones. Critical reflection leads to greater learning, it is said, as it involves active listening, an opportunity to clarify doubts and arguments, and to interact more effectively with team members. Second, it helps with better decision making and greater teamwork because one is taking informed decisions after having listened to all team members. It also helps with better program implementation through regular evaluation of ongoing work, monitoring progress towards goalposts, and identifying and eliminating wasted or duplicated effort. Another key way in which it helps is our ability to change, to adapt to changing environments. When one takes stock of a situation, for instance, regularly with all team members, there is greater agility in responding to changes in the social, economic, policy, or any other changes happening in the environment. It also, of course, leads to higher team morale because everybody feels that they have a voice and that their perspectives are being taken into account, and it helps them feel more integrated in the team. It also, very importantly, helps with keeping a sharper and sustained focus on goals by thinking differently about possible pathways to the goal and to think about and to overcome barriers. Lastly, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list of all the value propositions underlying critical reflection, but just to conclude this slide here, it helps as an experience multiplier. What do we mean by that is that, for instance, best practices can be identified within a team or organization and shared across verticals or even within a team. So those are some of the top value propositions that one came across in the literature. Lastly, how exactly does pause and reflect work? So, what are the interpersonal psychological processes that are put in motion when we reflect? And due to this critical reflection, how do we derive value, which in turn raises the level of our work? The argument for this is based on the dual process theory and its application to the learning process. Dual process theory suggests the existence of two systems of thought that underlie learning. First, system 1, which is intuitive, fast, automatic, non-conscious, and independent of cognitive ability. System 1 is associated with experience-based decision-making and implicit learning. And then we have system 2, which is slow, deliberative, and a reflective process that requires memory and typically is described as slow, conscious, rule-based, and correlated with cognitive ability. System 2 is associated with considered decision-making and explicit learning. Research shows that the automatic, unconscious process of learning generated by doing becomes more effective if deliberately coupled with the controlled, conscious attempt at learning by thinking. Research has also shown that by reflecting on and articulating the key lessons learned from an experience, a person boosts his or her self-efficacy, which in turn has a positive effect on learning. So how exactly does this happen? It is well established that the desire to feel competent and capable is a basic human motivation. Self-efficacy has been shown to predict individuals' thoughts, emotions, and actions. When people experience high self-efficacy in an activity, they give it more time, more energy, because they feel that their efforts will lead to success. Self-efficacy has also been found to be an essential motive to learn. For instance, people with high self-efficacy select more challenging tasks, push themselves harder, and have less adverse reactions when faced with difficulties. Overall, people with higher self-efficacy have been found to be more productive. So, how is self-efficacy? What are the major drivers of self-efficacy? It has been shown that information that shapes one's self-efficacy beliefs comes mainly from reflecting on one's own past experiences and articulating the key lessons learned. This strengthens self-efficacy by making people more comfortable and confident in performing the same or similar tasks going forward. And finally, research has shown that reflection aids learning outcomes by making explicit or codifying tacit knowledge. So how does this work? The process of transforming tacit into codified knowledge requires a cognitive investment that generates a deeper understanding of this knowledge. This process of greater cognitive investment leads to a greater understanding of the problem space itself and also an improved capacity for problem solving. This learning is even deeper when one not only codifies tacit knowledge, but also generates explicit insights to be shared or to be communicated to another person, team, or a larger group. In other words, what one is saying is that one can expect performance to increase, to become better, the most when reflection and sharing are done together. They are coupled. This line of argument should be familiar to those who teach and subscribe to the axiom that one learns the most on a subject by being forced to teach it. I will stop here and hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Purnima, for setting the stage with the value proposition for the pause and reflect practice. I really liked the framing that Purnima gave us, especially the part about thinking fast and slow. She's really framed out how important it is to have a deliberate coupling of the doing with the conscious attempt at learning, that is the thinking phase. In order to develop a learning organization and to institutionalize the practice of pause and reflect, there are a few elements that I'd like to elaborate on. The first is the mindsets that need to be present for pausing and reflecting. These concepts come from Buddhism, and the first one is the concept of the Mushin mind. This is a mind that is free of thought, free of distraction, and in my own framing, this is really the pause phase. That as an individual and as an organization, we have to build in a deliberate pause phase which enables us to have the space within our brains, the space within our minds, and the space within our organizations in order to absorb the more conscious learning state. The second mindset coming from Buddhism is the mindset of the beginner's mind. And this is the mental state of openness, enthusiasm, a denial of the preconceived ideas or attitudes. And this is the part where we can make that conscious learning happen, where we are using our curiosity, we are using our openness, we are asking questions and trying to really understand how things work. In order to further promote the beginner's mind, there are a number of different kinds of activities that are important to engage in. For example, we can identify what our expectations are and then flip them around. Have you understood what is true about the topic? Can you be 100% sure that it's true? What would happen if the opposite was actually true? These are the kinds of questions you can be asking yourself. The second is to be deliberate. When working on things that are known or familiar, you tend to operate without deep thought. By deliberately slowing down, you can force yourself to experience each step more slowly, and you leave room for open thought and analysis. Another one is to avoid assumptions. Again, when something is familiar, you tend to think that you know how it will go. Resist the temptation to make these assumptions and jump to the conclusions. Instead, you can take time to observe and see how things play out, and be conscious of when you are making assumptions and when you are making direct observations. Another activity that can promote the beginner's mind is to break something down into its component parts. Try to distill a topic or an activity into a simpler form. What are the basic elements? How do they interact? Which elements are important and which are dispensable? Another activity that promotes a beginner's mind is to channel your inner child. Ask simple questions. Ask for simple explanations. Again, don't make any assumptions. Ask the whys, or the how does that work? Why do you do it that way? Can you say more about that? Another activity is to eliminate the should and include the might. We hear this in design thinking quite often, and it is around the principle that language conditions thought. The word should attaches you to an outcome, whereas the word might leaves open possibility. Let go of the mental models and the language that leads to closed thinking about expected outcomes, and instead try incorporating the language that leads to open thinking about broader possibilities. Another activity to promote the beginner's mind is to detach your ego. The ego is present to protect us from psychological harm that others may inflict upon us. To maintain a strong ego, we tend to nurture it by knowing things and by trying to be right. However, being right is not necessarily helpful if the goal is to be a learning organization. For an organization to be most successful, it needs to focus on seeing things how they really are, not with a bias that comes with trying to be right. And finally, to promote a beginner's mind, it's critical to be present. When you're aware of what you're experiencing, as you're experiencing it, you are more likely to open your mind as you open your senses. Ask yourself the questions. What do you see, hear, smell, feel, taste? What patterns exist? What is confusing? Why is it confusing? What makes sense? Why does it make sense? And by practicing these activities, you really do promote that beginner's mind, and that helps facilitate the building of the learning organization and the pause and reflect session. Finally, thinking about a learning organization, we often think about the four core disciplines, and these come from the work that Peter Senge did in his seminal book called The Fifth Discipline. These four core disciplines of a learning organization include personal mastery, which is the ongoing processes of honest personal reflection and frank awareness of one's own viewpoints and the drivers. The second is mental models, and this is, again, becoming aware of our own biases and our own assumptions and constantly questioning the framing that we are putting on something. The third is having a shared vision. When we have a shared vision, we have a common understanding of a desired future, and this encourages the staff to make a deep and meaningful investment in helping the organization learn and evolve. And finally, there's team learning and dialogue. Knowledge and ideas are widely distributed across the organization, so we should be using the wisdom of the group. When we have open sharing and exploration of ideas, which is contrasted with proposing and defending a position, that open sharing and exploration of ideas makes thinking visible and helps expose the assumptions and clarifies the challenges. So that brings us to leadership and management. And what are the roles of leadership and management in leading a learning organization? We find that there's real balancing between leadership and management, and you need both of them. It's not an either or. But leadership is about inspiring the change and engaging others in that shared commitment to address the challenges and to reach higher goals. And that needs to be constantly balanced by a good management structure that can help steer the course and maintain that operational stability. But at the end of the day, I like to think about the quote that Oprah Winfrey has, that leadership is about empathy, and it's about having the ability to relate to and connect with people for the purpose of inspiring and empowering their lives. And so in my mind, it is really, the onus is on the leader to reflect all those core disciplines of the learning organization to promote the mindset of pause and reflect. Now I'd like to hand over to Jarret to talk about the practical implementation of pause and reflect.
Hi, my name is Jarret Cassaniti. I'm the Knowledge Management Advisor on Breakthrough Action, USAID's flagship social and behavior change project. About a year and a half ago, Elizabeth and I started monthly Pause and Reflect days for our project's roughly 300 staff. I'll convey what we've learned about the implementation process through 3 steps. Start by pausing, move to general reflection, then developed specific reflection prompts. Intentional pauses may seem backward to implementers and project managers. These are folks who always have more to get done than time allows. They may view pausing as something just for researchers and strategy-focused staff. So we recommend that leadership explain to everyone that taking a pause is supported at the highest levels. Consider explaining the benefit of pausing as described by our previous presenters. Then set aside a specific time that works for everyone. For large teams like ours, we recommend using a recurring date so that meetings and conversations can be scheduled at other times. Encourage staff to suspend all non-essential emails, chats, and calls. Early on in the implementation of our Pause and Reflect days, we heard from colleagues that having a designated and sanctioned time ensured they could engage in reflection. Initially, staff used the time to catch up on non-urgent but vitally important issues, such as finishing writing assignments, completing compliance courses, and deep reading best done alongside contemplation. We learned that staff quickly embraced pausing when it was not just another to-do on their list. Once staff became familiar with the intentional use of pausing, we introduced the deliberate use of reflection, first at the individual level and then with 1 or 2 colleagues. Encourage exploratory thinking about programs and work plan activities generally. Ask staff to consider how they might approach work in a new way to enhance chances for success. Give generic prompts to help them do this. Prompts that proved popular with our team included the following: looking at an email chain from a year ago and considering what made progress possible and what was learned during that year. Drafting a resume of failures and deliberating on the fact that we all make mistakes and have opportunities to learn from them. Writing a short letter to a hypothetical new staff about where the project is going and the unique role that you play. Be creative with these prompts, as many staff seldom have the opportunity to reflect on daily work in a purposeful way. Again, we do our best to make sure these are not extras that folks lump with their other to-dos. These prompts are meant to be accessible and lead to the relief of burdens, not add to them. Lastly, we started to provide detailed prompts that were more closely aligned with project goals and objectives. For large projects like ours, these prompts were focused on making sure our many cornfield teams were united when it came to things like project strategy, code of conduct, and knowledge sharing practices. We imagine that smaller teams might prompt reflection on emerging feedback or new information from or regarding project stakeholders or audiences. External data with the potential to affect project work might also be used to stimulate deep thinking and meaningful reflection. These might include new research results, guidance published by technical agencies, changes in government policy, or trends in popular culture. It's at this step when we also broadened our guidance to include small team reflection. Activities at this level might include an after-action review or harvest meeting to surface lessons learned and explore how these lessons could inform future activities. This sequence, starting with pausing, moving to reflection, then providing specific prompts, worked well for our large team. I'll leave you with a short story I'm rather fond of. There are two guys hanging out, reminiscing about their lives and what the future holds. One turns to the next and exclaims, "You know what I'm looking forward to?" The other looks at him and asks, "What?" "Hindsight," says the first. "I'm looking forward to hindsight."
Hello, Helen Blackholly from Mary Stopes International. I'm going to talk to you today about getting the most out of your data. I've got 9 key messages for you. First one, you are going to forget most of what's been said today unless you reapply it very, very fast. The graph there shows you the amount of information you will retain. After 20 minutes, it's down to 58%. After a day, it's down to a third. So remember the forgetting curve. What you have to do is reapply that information that you've just heard about as quickly as possible. And then you stand a chance of doing something about it. Second message, turning data into something that is very meaningful is not easy. It's a true skill. And one of the mindsets that you're recruiting for is what I call curiosity. And what you'll need also to do is, with that curiosity, is look for people who will say, "So what? Now what?" Really powerful questions which will tell you what you need to find out and therefore do with that data. Message 3, create institutional best practice. What this is going to do is give you the power of putting everything in one place and training and using that data so it talks to one another. Use co-creation. You've heard some about that already, because teams listen to teams, and make that data readily available and put it into the workflow. Best practice. Message 4, your research, monitoring and evaluation teams have to be thought of and have to behave as business partners. They need to care about data and they need to communicate. I always say to my team, if you're trying to communicate and get a message through, the minimum number of times you're going to have to talk about it is 7. I've made that number up, but I think it probably works because most people just communicate something once. Tackle the problem cross-functionally. The answers are always going to be much more powerful if you do that together. Message 5, know what question you want to ask first. Most people set off charging into a data warehouse effectively, but not really 100% sure what they're looking for. So I always ask them to drive. Now the D stands for define. Define the question. If you don't know what you're setting out to do, the rest of it falls apart. R, research, but don't assume that you've got to start something new. Invariably, you already have some of the information to help you answer that question. Look for it. I is the insight, drawing something meaningful, the so what out. And the V is visualize. Make it stand out so you can tell the story, because that is going to help you with E, which is to execute. Message 6, watch out for assumptions and make sure that you thoroughly understand what that evaluation was trying to do before you start off to evaluate it. Now that means getting your RME teams involved early, and they have to know what the intervention period was. Particularly important for marketing evaluations. Easy to say, but not always easy to do. Message 7, it's all about compare and contrast and benchmark. Often people just look at one slice of data. That is totally meaningless. Triangulate with different data sources. And if it's telling you something different, good, because it means that you're thinking about what that data is trying to do, and it just might mean that it didn't work, and that's okay too as well. And ask very simple benchmarking and trend questions. Is this part of a trend? Is it a one-off? Is it a good number or a bad number? That will help you benchmark. And make sure that on any charts you contextualize and put the key headlines, annotate the data. In other words, make it easy for the viewer to understand what that data is trying to say. Message 8 is all about visualize. And the main thing here is to ensure that you can explore the data, you can explain it, you can work around it, and you can visualize it and pull it together. Make it easy. And the final message I have for you is have a team leader who believes in messages 1 to 8. Without that, you really are going to struggle to make meaning out of data. Good luck.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are participating from. I'm Aisiri Adolor. I work with the Center for Communications and Social Impact. I'll be taking the section on overcoming barriers. We've looked at values, we've looked at mindset, we talked about how to run a pause and reflect, and finding meaning in data in earlier sections. I'll be walking you through overcoming barriers to running a pause and reflect. Well, this is just a note. Never stop learning despite the barriers to learning. So what are the common barriers to pause and reflect? Number 1 is lack of leadership. Where organizations lack the leadership required to champion pause and reflect, then it becomes difficult. Remember, everything rises and falls on the leaders. If there's leadership to pilot and to champion pause and reflect, then the organization is well on the way to being a learning organization. Second, immediate pressure prevents taking time to pause. Pressures to deliver, pausing and reflect is deprioritized. It's not a priority anymore. Lack of organizational process to act on pause and reflect. For organizations that do carry out pause and reflect, if they do not act on the result or the findings, then the staff become discouraged to continue in subsequent pause and reflect sessions. Reluctance to share, and then the fear of failure. People are usually reluctant to share their knowledge and their experiences with others, and then they are afraid to share failures as well because they might punish for that. So we must be able to create an environment where people are willing to share. Benefits are unclear. When the benefits of a pause and reflect is unclear, people are very unlikely to engage in a pause and reflect activities. And when it is not a priority, like I said, this again is a leadership problem. And then last but not the least, when people are unsure, they don't know how to run a pause and reflect session, they will hardly engage in it. So these are the common barriers to running pause and reflect. How do we overcome these barriers? Number 1, leadership must model change. Leadership should set long-term goals, strategic objectives for organizational learning, and then set systems and approaches on achieving that goal. Leadership should vocally support pause and reflect sections and create an environment that encourages staff members to share learnings and experiences. And that's bullet number 2, creating a learning culture. Leadership must do that. It's a mechanism that should be set up by leadership and championed by leadership. Third, we must build internal capacity for pause and reflect. If you're going to run a pause and reflect session, then you need a capacity, and these sections we are presenting is just one of the tools to guide organizations to doing that. Donor support as well. If donors could add pause and reflect as a critical part of proposal appraisal, then I think most organizations will be encouraged to run a pause and reflect session. So make pause and reflect a habit. Let it be a routine. Let it not be something that's one-off. Let it be a regular thing, either monthly, just periodic, and then it becomes habitual. Then we must demonstrate the value of pause and reflect. We must demonstrate the value of pause and reflect. And last but not the least, hold no blame. Hold no blame. Whatever you do, don't blame people. Let people be free to share their findings and to discuss freely. I believe with this, we'll be able to run pause and reflect, and people will be encouraged to do same. Thank you.
I think it's my turn to come on now to thank all our presenters. We had pre-recorded that, so I hope it was relatively smoothly attended to by everyone. I hope whoever's managing the slides can shift us to the slide about the follow-up activities. And as that's happening, I will encourage everyone to put any questions in the chat box, or feel free to speak up with any questions. Just unmute yourselves.
Please go two up, the slide, I think.
There we go. That's the one. Perfect. So, oops, too far. There we go. So just because we want to really practice what we preach, between now and our next meeting next week, we have suggested a set of activities to help you all start your own pause and reflect practice. And what we are asking each and every one of you to do is to actually, on your calendars, find a time where you can dedicate a minimum of 10 minutes, but hopefully at least 30 minutes to an hour. This slide, the information on this slide will be shared by email, so you'll have all the links. But what we are asking you to do is to set aside that time on your calendar and pick one or more of these activities to practice starting a pause and reflect practice. And then once you have had an experience with one or more of these, then we will ask you to send an email, and the email information will be provided in with this information. Send an email with a quick reflection on what your experience was in doing one or more of these activities. And then next week when we regroup, we will reflect a little bit on what the experiences were that people had. So just to quickly run through while you're getting your questions organized, one of the suggestions is to start with the pause phase. And as you heard in my presentation, thinking about the Mushin mind, the beginner's mind, we will provide you with an example of a 10-minute meditation that can help you achieve that, that mindset. So that's one example. Second example would be, again, for some individual reflection, consider taking a personality assessment. This can help you think about how your personality complements, helps, or hinders your work. Third activity that you could do to start your pause and reflect practice would be if you have the opportunity to get together with another colleague. Obviously, it's difficult for most of us right now, but consider taking a walking meeting that can help foster creativity. And maybe that is something that you could do with a colleague who lives nearby you. Another would be there are a few examples here that came up in Jarret's slide as well about looking at an email or an email chain from a year ago to consider how far you've gone. Number 6 is writing a short letter to a hypothetical staff. That's another one that Jarret had suggested, or the resume of failures. And then finally, just jumping back up to number 5, we have put together a Google Doc with some cartoons. If you can look at that or those quotes that are there to think about what these cartoons or any of those quotes might mean in your work. So all of this information will come in an email later today, as well as the details about how to share your reflection back to us so that we can process that next week. Now, I would like us to move on to a few questions. I don't know if anybody has a burning question. I saw one or two in the chat, which we will circle back to. So maybe we can even start, Helen. There was the question about a definition of an insight. I know you answered it in the chat, but we'd love to hear your response out loud. Thanks, Helen.
Hi. Yes, I think it's one of those things that it's when you go, aha, 2 or 3 or 4 facts have come together and they've combined in a way that makes you look at the outcome from that in a very different perspective. And normally people would refer to it as a light bulb moment, when you suddenly go, I hadn't thought of it that way. And that is when you've got usually an aha moment, which is when you've got an insight. One of the biggest frustrations I have is when people actually talk about insights, but basically they're just a fact. And I think people struggle to differentiate between fact and insight. Insight is something really meaningful that you can action and you can do something with. A fact on its own, you can't. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Helen. The next one I would like to pose is for Jarret. This came out of the chat as well. And this question was about how to avoid making pause and reflect a burden. Jarret?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. That has been a chief concern of ours, I think, and I touched on it in the presentation. I think it's tricky. You want to make sure that your staff are utilizing their time well. So what we've done is really tried to be as open as possible initially to help people see the value of pausing and allowing them and trusting them to make good choices. And this is tricky. It does touch on the trust that we talked about yesterday a lot, and those soft skills and making sure that our relationships are strong. And then, of course, I think assessing whether or not they do feel as if it's a burden or not, and adapting. So I think those are things that you can consider, and making sure that this isn't something extra or something that is another to-do that is going to add to the stress of your staff.
Thanks, Jarret. Maybe just to further contribute, I think our first, when we adopted this practice in Breakthrough Action, we really, really focused on pause first. And I think that turned it into a real asset for people. And it helped people then move, once they had established an effective pause practice, it helped them move into reflection more easily. So I think focusing on that was helpful. I'm going to move to a couple other questions that I have, and then I'll shift back to those in the chat. Purnima, there was one question on, in your experience, what is the single greatest benefit of pause and reflect? Purnima?
Yes.
And feel free to turn on your video if your internet will allow it.
No, I don't think my internet will allow it, actually. There is a problem with connectivity today, especially in my building. So sorry, I won't be able to turn it on. I would say one of the biggest advantages of pause and reflect, and I can think of an example in the last year or so, has been when we were involved with an intervention, and midway through the intervention, something happened in the policy environment which completely gobsmacked us. This was an entertainment education program, and it was sailing along smoothly, and we expected viewership to be at a certain level. And then there was a policy regulation which came into place, which changed the entire television landscape in India as to how people subscribe to channels, how much they have to pay out on a monthly basis and whatnot. This was a program focused on the poor and the marginalized. So we had specifically chosen a platform that reaches those people, and suddenly they were being asked to pay for something which had been free up till that point. I was leading the team on evaluating this program, and we were caught in a position where we did not have enough people who were exposed to the program, and we knew going in, into an end-line data collection that we would not get enough people exposed. And so what we did was we actually did an all partners meet. There were several evaluation agencies involved. We got the implementer in, we got the funder in. And this was like almost a half-day session where we were trying to figure out what to do because everyone was panicking. So we literally did take a deep breath and say that, okay, this has happened. It's not the end of the world. Let's figure out a way to get enough people who are exposed. And then we designed, an encouragement design, which was not there in the beginning. We had to inject some money into the evaluation to support that the monetary incentivization. So yeah, it helped get a project back on its feet when we were thinking that, it's a sinking ship. So goalposts keep moving. What you thought of a year back when you started implementing the program, things don't always, the best laid plans go awry. So it's important to make space for that. And this sort of helped us. And it wasn't a single session. There were a lot of emails, and it was finally, after a point when everyone realized that we really do need to pause everything, take stock of the situation, and figure out a solution together. So yeah, teamwork, thinking about things differently, keeping sight of the goals and the various goalposts and whatnot.
Thanks for that, Purnima. I appreciate that. I have a question now for Adolor. I think and hope Adolor is here, and if possible, we'll be able to turn his video on. This one is also coming from the chat. In your experience, what are the biggest barriers or challenges to doing pause and reflect?
Thank you, Elizabeth. For me, I think the biggest barrier is when leadership fails to create that platform. People are typically afraid or scared to share what they have learned, because probably if they share, they don't know their stand again in the organization. Will they be kicked out or something? So people want to retain their knowledge. And then for failures or what apparently went wrong, a lot of people are scared to share that. How do I express this? How do I express this? How do I share this failure? What would my boss say? So if leadership can help people to understand that working is learning and failures are part of learning, and make people feel comfortable to learn from their failures, I think a lot more people will be willing to share what they have, particularly where they have failed and what they have learned from their failures. We see a lot of share fairs and fail fairs, and we see people really scared to share what failures they've had, in one way or the other. So I think one of the challenges, people willing to share what they have learned, and secondly, people willing to share where they have failed and what they learned from what they have failed. And I think the third thing I consider a big barrier is when the leadership do not have value for learning. Like I said before, everything rises and falls at leadership. So if the leaders of the organization do not value learning, we most of us working and implementing organizations that are driven by activities where at every time you almost have to do, you are always on the move. So when the leadership do not have value for learning, it becomes difficult to pause and reflect. Thank you, Elizabeth and Cobra.
Thank you, Adolor. I really appreciate that. Unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left and we have so many great questions. So I think I will pick maybe one more and see how we go on time. And then the rest we will factor into our follow-up session next week. I really liked Vish's question on the difference in pause and reflect sessions between crisis and non-crisis times. And I'm not sure if any one of our presenters might have some reflection on that. Feel free to speak up. Thanks, Helen.
I'll give it a go. I think pause and reflect becomes much harder when everybody is busy running. A little bit like little animals in a cage, just running around. And in many ways, actually, I think you have to accept that. Sometimes things are urgent, they just need to get done. But as that phase is coming through, and I think we're coming, certainly for COVID-19, our teams have just absolutely got on and done, been unbelievably creative and innovative. But now is the time, actually, which is to sort of start to reflect on, well, what has worked particularly well, and how can we take this more perhaps into day-to-day work. So I think the first message is pick your time. You're not going to get a lot of endorsement and acceptance if somebody is busy working 18 hours a day. And I think you just have to be a bit conscious of that. I think the second piece there, and it also ties into that other question, which is really about how do you persuade senior leaders, that it's worthwhile. I think you turn it round into what problem are we trying to solve, and therefore actually how can pause and reflect help with that problem solving. Pause and reflect as a thing on its own is quite hard to sell to senior leaders, but if you can spin it the other way around to say here are the benefits in it, it becomes much easier. Back to the rest.
Thanks so much, Helen. Purnima, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I thought that was a particularly great question. And I did describe a crisis situation. But I think one of the important things, and a point well taken, Helen, when a lot of us are busy working hard, it's difficult to carve out that time. But I think organizations need to put in place this protected time, whether it's once a week, once a fortnight, once a month. I don't know, it will depend. But also a safe space for, because reflection cannot happen in a space where you are thinking about what will so-and-so think about, what I'm going to say. And I think one of the biggest challenges in that is also, so both time and a safe space. And if that can be done in panicked times when you're not firefighting, I really think one of the biggest advantages is of building that feeling of being an integral part of a team. So building that collaborative spirit of community in an organization, I think that's very important, especially in today's economy, which has, at least in India, it's a very gig economy. So in the dev sector. So I think that's very important.
Thanks, Purnima. Anybody else want to add any last final comment? As I said, the rest of the questions we will make an effort to respond to in the follow-up. Otherwise, I can just close with perhaps a response on the question between pause and reflect being different from mindful relaxation or the meditation process. And in my mind, it is different just because of what the intended outcome is. And for me, the Mushin mind and the process of doing a meditation to achieve a Mushin mind is one not for the purpose of relaxation, but to open the space in one's mind to be open to new possibilities and new things as opposed to relaxation. It may have the same results, but I do think there's a different purpose in mind. So on that note, I think I will hand over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the working group. Thank you to Elizabeth, Purnima, Jarret, Adolor, and Helen. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for your feedback and comments. Those will all be fed into the ultimate publication of this working group's perspective on pause and reflect. If you have any further thoughts and comments, please do share them with the curve at mcsachi.com. We'll make sure those are shared with the working group, and please, of course, include your name so that we can recognize you as a contributor. I'll now hand over to my colleague Tom to introduce Christina Serlemitsos.